Everyone to the Centre for Sustainability. I'm Caroline Orchiston, I'm the Director here at the Centre, and today it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr Abbi Virens, who's been working with us here at the Centre through her PhD and has recently, not that recently, got involved in the Green Hydrogen Project as a social scientist working amongst a lot of engineering research. So really looking forward to hearing about your experiences working on the project and some of the outcomes of the work. Yeah. Kia ora.
Well, hello everybody. I guess I know everyone in the room and those on Zoom. Hello to you too. So I'm Abbi Virens, like Karen said. I'm a postdoctoral fellow working on the Green Hydrogen Program with GNS. And the project is 5 years long. I believe we have about a year and a bit left to go. And so my job on the project is to look at the social dimensions of green hydrogen, and the project encompasses, like Carolyn mentioned, some engineers, economists. We're looking at different facets of a potential green hydrogen transition in New Zealand. And so my job's kind of broad, looking at the social component of that. But a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on today is the claims that are really have been associated with green hydrogen, because there's not a lot of social things that we can observe, because green hydrogen's in an early development phase. So I kind of was more talking to people who, like, what do you think is going to happen about green hydrogen? Where do you think it's likely going to be? And from that, I got some really interesting data. And so my talk today doesn't just talk about green hydrogen, but also talks about how we understand technology, how we understand energy, and how that might facilitate how we think about new technologies and how they might fit into our social understanding of things. So,
sometimes you just need to put the mouse over the visible mouse so that the arrow is on.
there we go. Okay, cool. So, just do a brief introduction to what green hydrogen is if you're not familiar. So green hydrogen is, I guess, new, well, not very new, but right now is a technology that's in development that is suggested to help us with achieving carbon neutrality, reducing emissions. And hydrogen is being used as an energy vector of fuel. So it would be used instead of petrol. Think of it more similar to electricity as a vector rather than comparing it to renewables, because it uses renewables to generate energy. So there's green production from renewable electricity. So you can use solar, you can use wind, and you use the water. I'll have a picture in a second of an electrolyzer to break hydrogen and oxygen apart, and you contain the hydrogen to a gas or a liquid ammonia, and you use that as energy to power different things. And so this is a really helpful tool because it could replace a lot of sectors that are difficult to electrify. So things that currently rely on fossil fuels, that there at this point is not maybe an easy way to electrify them at this point. So some of the examples where it would be really useful is heavy transport, steel manufacturing, fertilizer production, things that need high process heat, that kind of thing. And yeah, I think that's kind of gives you the gist of it. So this is just an example of how green hydrogen will be produced, the power supply being solar or wind, and that energy, electricity would then be used in an electrolyzer, and that energy would create the hydrogen. So this is a visual from the green paper from the government. It was a vision for green hydrogen New Zealand that was released in 2019, so it's a couple of years old now. And this is just an example of how green hydrogen could be used. And it's pretty broad in the sense that it really encompasses a lot of different ways green hydrogen can be used. That doesn't mean all of them are actually going to be used this way. It was a very ambitious paper, I would say. So there's like a big electrolyzer here and it's powered by renewables. This could be going into some sort of grid system, could be used to power houses. It's more likely that it's going to be used in niche areas, so maybe more for heavy transport, in particular industries. There's also lots of talk about using hydrogen for export to export energy to other countries and markets that would have more difficulty in decarbonizing. But this just kind of gives you some visual of what the government was thinking at the time. And so this is a map from the New Zealand Hydrogen Council. And these are all the different projects that are going on in New Zealand that talk about or thinking about using hydrogen in various different ways. And I won't go through all of them, but you can just see that there's a lot of different things going on. A lot of these are in development or they're processes that are ongoing. But I would say I did my interviews early last year, and the projects have probably doubled since then. So a lot of stuff is happening. A lot of people are thinking about different ways it can be used and tested. And so there's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I mentioned when I started, this isn't just about green hydrogen, but it's also about technology, how claims are being made about technology. Because green hydrogen is in this phase of early development, a lot of what we understand of it, or a lot of the social component of how people understand green hydrogen is through the claims that are being made about it. And I think it's a very important step in technological development because based on what people say a technology is capable of doing, people will take action based on whether they think that's true or that's possible, if they think it's desirable. So the claim actually has a lot of weight to it. So talking to people about what they think about green hydrogen, especially experts, people involved in this field, is actually revealing a lot more than you might think. So it's really great to be able to look at things in action and see them happening, but I think that it's also important to consider that what people say about things tells us quite a lot. And claims actually can create this kind of network when people start to gather together because they think that something is worthwhile, like you can see on that map of different green hydrogen projects. People start coming together, they start facilitating, making projects. Engineers, investors, policymakers, and the public are all kind of gathered together and have to share information. So you need some way to deliver this information that everyone understands. And this also creates an expectation for the future. So a lot of technology and innovation is really something that's based in the future and what people think is probable. People think that it's desirable, that lines up with their vision of the future. So while a lot of these conversations are talking about what could happen somewhere, a few years down the line, it's also revealing what they understand about the present and where they think things are. So we can't actually predict the future with any degree of certainty, I suppose, but we are shaping the future based on what we feel it should look like. So if we act on, say, a claim about green hydrogen because we think it's possible, that does shape the future and what is possible with energy transitions. So I think that there's a lot of talk about green hydrogen being a hype, but we shouldn't dismiss these claims as being hype alone because people will act on it. It could be very powerful. It could generate a lot of attention and development and research. It also could do the reverse, of course. And I guess I kind of mentioned this already, but in these claims, there's a lot of interesting information about how proponents of green hydrogen understand the present, how they understand the future, how they understand the current energy system, and what they think is possible with technology. And one of the big questions that we wanted to ask when we got into this project is the future that green hydrogen presents a just energy future? Does it present a future where we're transitioning not just different parts of that energy system, but are we transforming it in a way that it's better for people to use, better energy access, solving some of the problems that we currently have. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about defining technology. And a simple definition of technology is a solution to a problem. And this was a really common way that engineers described hydrogen to me, that it's just a solution to a problem. But this poses an important question about what is the problem we're trying to fix? What's technology's role in solving that problem? If we think of the problem just as decarbonization, then, you know, green hydrogen offers a really effective solution to that. But what else is going on in the energy system? You have to think about more context. The way that green hydrogen is discussed is sometimes talked about as a silver bullet. So being able to slot in and replace fossil fuels kind of suggests this kind of transformation of the whole energy system, but what do they really mean? And I think a lot of this discussion, talking about something as a silver bullet or something as transformative, comes from understanding technology as techno-deterministic. So that means that technology determines society, that society you know, is kind of functioning in a certain way, and a technology comes in and just totally transforms how people interact with each other. And I think we find this quite often in the ways that we understand past technologies. If we think about how fossil fuels are described, this is talking about, you know, societal transformation, which is true, but it's also missing the kind of key point that there's a lot more social things that are going on with technology development, how people choose technologies, how they fit in with current social structures and systems, that really ignores the fact that technology has a certain power, but only because people in society have power. So it's not that the technology just comes and bulldozes everything and can transform things. And when we think about this in terms of the future, we're thinking about technologies as being really efficient and solving certain problems, like discussed earlier, just a simple solution to a problem, but that by solving that problem, it will also kind of change society at the same time. But I think the important thing is if you think about technology just in terms of its technical effects, or just as its technical capabilities, how efficient it is, you're not actually designing technology that suits society. You're not describing or designing technology in a way that understands the social landscape very well. So there's a strong social dimension of technology, and I think that people who have studied science and technology studies or sociology or any various humanities understand this, but I think that it's really missing even just in common ways of describing technology, you know, especially when we talk about AI or some sort of new technology as it's just going to transform, it's going to take over. And I think that's very common to describe technologies as having a force that's beyond our own. But technologies don't emerge out of nowhere. They come from a social context, how we understand the world, how we construct problems, and how imaginative we are with the ways that we solve problems influences how we approach technology. So technology kind of can both limit and expand the way that we understand the world. And our social environment is complex. It's not without inequality. So you can't just introduce a technology and it smooths out all that inequality. You're placing it in an already unequal situation. You have to think about how that's going to pay to choose it. So historical technological narratives, like I mentioned already, kind of, I'm going to talk about the fossil fuel narrative in a second because I think it has interesting parallels. Show that technologies aren't taken up because they're the most efficient, but they're described as that was the reason why people took them up. And that for those reasons, there was no other option, and they were the best for the test, the best solution. But often technologies are chosen because they're the most effective to perpetuate power structures and social dynamics. So this example that I'll bring up in a second is very effective at describing why technologies are very social. So I read this interesting paper by Kara Daggett, and she describes what she calls the fossil myth. And she suggests that we've been led to believe an energy myth that fossil fuels were the most efficient energy vector for society, that we needed them to progress society, that they were social good. We had to utilize this technology. And she states that fossil fuels were actually not the most efficient, but were just the best suited to the development of extractive political arrangements. And she's specifically referring to capitalism and colonialism. And if you've read Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital, he describes a very similar argument, where he describes the transformation of water power into coal in the UK specifically. And he says that water power was actually more efficient when it comes to energy, but that you couldn't transport it to different places. You had to be in a location where there's water available, or you have to divert water to your location. Where fossil fuels, you can use anywhere. You can create an industry where you want them. And for that reason, they're a much more effective energy source than what was currently used with water power. And I took this quote from Daggett because I thought it was very effective. She says, "The narrow focus on fuel and technology reflects a dominant narrative or myth about how humans have changed fuel systems over time. The story, which has proven difficult to dislodge in the popular imagination, foregrounds the trend of energy expansion as technological progress across the long arc of human species history. It gains its authority in part by universalizing and naturalizing its claims, appealing to that deep history and supposed human nature. According to this potent fossil fable, humans as a species desire ever more energy, and a series of technological innovations have provided it. Any attendant exploitation and injustice are mostly understood as externalities, ungainly appendages to the human drive for fuel that can be repaired by further technology." And in particular, these themes that she talks about, humans desiring ever more energy, how technology can always supply more energy for us, is a popular thing that I actually came out through some of my interviews. And I think that understanding how we conceptualize energy, how we conceptualize the role of energy in society is a really important thing to be questioning, because when it comes to climate change, when it comes to energy transitions, if we continue to use this kind of narrative to guide our decisions, if we think that all of our decisions should be made based on accumulating more energy at any cost, this is the issue that has led us to this point. This is the kind of narrative that has created, global domination, networks of inequality. It's something that I think is really critical to consider when we're thinking about new technologies that are hopefully going to replace fossil fuels. So the fossil myth is flawed in the way that it understands the relationship between society, power, and technology. Like when I talked about technological determinism, it very much emphasizes that technology can solve all of our problems, and technology will inevitably progress our society to something better. But the cost of fossil fuels in terms of human and environmental well-being can't be justified through this narrative of efficiency or accumulation of energy. When we think about how we got to this point to be in a climate crisis, and then thinking about how fossil fuels are really efficient doesn't really seem to match up. So understanding how technology has been used in the past to perpetuate systems of oppression is also important for how we understand using technology in the future. So sometimes it seems like looking backwards is not helpful, but I think it's actually the opposite. I think that unpacking past narratives and understanding them in new ways is really effective to looking into the future. So when we're thinking of visions of an energy future, new transition technologies should ideally present not only ways for us to decarbonize, but also better ways to understand the energy system. So it should be supplying not only just replacements, but also better ways to use energy, better ways to get energy to the people that need them. The fossil narrative implies that you could have a new technology, but it could still be perpetuating the same inequality. So renewables doesn't necessarily mean that the system is better. It might mean there's less carbon in the atmosphere, but it also might present some new problems or perpetuate existing ones. So technological claims should present a vision of the future that understands both the technical and social challenges of that energy transition. If we're just looking at the technical side and hoping that the social side will just be packaged along with it, then we're really ignoring a huge factor. So green hydrogen, in my experience, doesn't seem to present a new energy narrative. And that doesn't mean that it can't, it's just at this point it is not. A strong component of its argument is that hydrogen is easy to replace fossil fuels. And in that way, it doesn't promise to change the system. It's actually most comforting because it doesn't change anything. And there was a little while where First Gas, I believe, had this advertisement regarding their plans to maybe transition from gas to hydrogen. And the advertisement said something like, you don't have to change anything because you can still use gas the way that you've been using it now, but it will just be hydrogen. You don't have to feel bad about it. And that's kind of the thing that seems to be encouraging people or motivating people with hydrogen, is that the lack of change makes it feel really easy. And it's like we don't actually have to take on any behavioral change. We don't have to think about things any differently. And I can see why that's appealing. Like, this isn't a judgment. It's just that when it comes to adapting to climate change, we have to make some big shifts, and we have to do things that are uncomfortable and think about things that are uncomfortable. And the fact that green hydrogen doesn't want us to do that is kind of problematic. And I'll have some quotes soon of how this generated some concern in the interviews. So in early 2002, I interviewed 20 experts. And when I showed the map of different projects that were going on, at that point, there was maybe half of the projects that were going on. So there's probably lots more people who would be able to be interviewed now. Expert in this case, I understood in a very broad capacity. We think about technology as creating a network of people. This isn't just engineers or people who are involved in specific hydrogen projects, but it's also thinking about people who might be working in the current energy industry, gas industry, electrical industry, people who just understand energy based on potentially their jobs. I also talked to community groups, specifically groups in Taranaki, because at that time, First Gas had their project up there. So it was kind of thinking they already have a long experience with the fossil fuel industry. What would they think about a transition, that kind of thing. It's important to think about these people as experts in their own right, because they present some ideas or concerns about green hydrogen that are likely not to come up with people who are involved in the project. So we were looking for people who really supported green hydrogen, but also people who critiqued it, because I think that those critiques could be really helpful for my project and other projects to consider the other ideas that are going around, and that they actually potentially have some weight that could transform how they approach their projects. So the results from the interviews in terms of application of green hydrogen was unclear. So I guess the question that we were asking initially wasn't, it wasn't just how do you imagine green hydrogen, it also was where do you see it being used? Is there certain areas? But the results were really mixed. The most common result was that green hydrogen would be used, but maybe in a particular niche area, might be used in heavy transport, aviation, fertilizer, steel manufacturing. People kind of seem to have different ideas of what they thought was the best use of it. And even people who were critical of green hydrogen said that it has its place. So they didn't disagree with green hydrogen being used completely. I mean, there was a few, we have some outliers, but the idea was that it is a useful technology, and they weren't dismissing it. But where it should be used or how it should be used was a bit more unclear. Oh, and the final point, the green hydrogen as an export market was a highly contentious issue. I think because it has a lot of unknowns. Generally what I found was some people were saying this is New Zealand's opportunity to get into the new market, it's going to provide so much income to New Zealand, it's going to like really rejuvenate our economy, that kind of thing. And other people saying that it's a terrible idea and it, has a lot of risks associated with it. So that one in particular drew a strong response, I would say. So even though I didn't get a clear picture of how green hydrogen would be used, and if I did these interviews again now, even with more projects, I suspect I would get something similar, because I think there isn't a decisive or really clear way of using hydrogen at this point. So what I thought was more interesting was how people were describing it. And I focused more on this because I thought that there was a lot more, I guess, like I thought it was more interesting than just how we're going to use it is how we're thinking about it. So there's this strong narrative of how proponents spoke about green hydrogen, but there was also a strong counter narrative that didn't, like I mentioned earlier, didn't oppose to the use of green hydrogen, but was dissatisfied with how this narrative seemed to ignore the range of complexities that the energy transition presents. So I just have a few quotes here just to kind of give some more texture, I suppose, to the interviews that I did. This quote here I've described as the right vector for the task, and I think this really complements that idea that technology is a solution to a problem. So Calvin, and I've changed all the names obviously to protect the privacy of people, but he was a power systems engineer, and he described a lot of the way he described things as an engineer's mindset. And he describes green hydrogen as it's a choice of choosing the right vector for the right task. Ideally, it's all electricity for what you need, but I don't have a solution for long distance transport available right now at scale. That's why it's in the mix, because it's choosing hydrogen for the bits that direct use electricity we cannot solve right now. Because the problem we have to solve is carbon neutral by 2050. We have to get the heavy lifting done in 15 years. Therefore, we've only got a certain amount of technologies that we can apply. In that context, it's then saying use electricity directly for these, and how do we solve those? That's why I use hydrogen for that. So this was kind of a more, I would say, neutral response, just saying that it gets the job done. We need to use it for these particular things. He's concerned about getting to carbon neutral, and I think that was something that everyone kind of agreed on. The goal is to make New Zealand carbon neutral by 2050 based on our Paris agreements. So all of these motivations to use green hydrogen come from a good place. I don't think that people who believe in green hydrogen are morally objectionable or anything like that. They're just viewing the issues in a particular way. So then there's also this quote from Ben, who was an energy investment manager. And he says, there's also, like you mentioned, that concern around that word. Should we be actually looking to use more energy, or should we just go ahead and use less? I love that utopian idea. But are we really going to change that much? No. Love the ambition, or that we're going to suddenly start using less energy, but I hate to say it, I think it's going to be the other way around. I think we'll continue to find new ways to use more energy, pretty energy hungry. Probably new applications that require energy, while others will look to become more efficient. So Ben really represents that, that idea that I mentioned that really complements the fossil narrative that our society requires more energy. And even if we wanted to kind of change our behavior, we're likely not to. We're just going to continue to find more technological ways to provide that energy for ourselves. And I think this quote is really helpful, particularly in comparison to the quote that I'm going to use that's more critical of green hydrogen. Because I think that the behavioral change to use less energy would affect everyone, and it would be a big shift in society. And I think that sounds really hard, where having some sort of technological fix of having something slot in and be like, we don't have to worry now, we're not emitting carbon, we're still driving our cars, and everything's okay. It feels nicer. That feels more comforting. And so I don't think that I think on an emotional level, I totally understand why people are compelled to believe that hydrogen is the solution. And so Gareth, who's an innovator, and I guess we have to take Gareth's quote with a grain of salt because innovators are going to give us claims that are quite utopian because that's kind of in some sense their job. Making technological claims, you have to almost overshoot what is actually possible to get investors interested in what you're doing. And it's just the nature of how innovation works at this point. So what he's saying is on the far end of optimism, we would say. And so he's saying it's hugely challenging because it's capital intensive and it's way before its demand and all that stuff. But ultimately you feel that it's where we need to get to. It's almost in some ways mirroring what the petrol and diesel distribution networks look like. Refueling systems and refueling stations. If you think about that as an end state, multiple places where people can fill up their trucks and cars. But then I think we have to think differently than that. That's how things work today. But in a world where houses could be powered by solar, you could put a couple extra solar panels on your house, export to the grid or export to an electrolyzer, and make your own hydrogen car. So, in the first part of this quote, Gareth is talking about making a hydrogen refueling network. So that would be kind of like how we have gas stations now, but hydrogen and fill up cars. And they're already starting to think about this in terms of heavy transport. So when I mentioned earlier that people had different ideas of how they thought green hydrogen would be used in New Zealand, I think it's also important to think that how green hydrogen is being used could result in a very different kind of energy system. If we're thinking about a full-scale network that's connecting the transport industry that's across New Zealand. We're thinking about just steel manufacturing, that's a very localized hydrogen production. And hydrogen electrolyzers, you kind of saw in that map from the green paper, are big. They're like big, I would say like, TY big. So electrolyzers aren't like these, they can be portable, I suppose, like he describes in individual houses. But when we're thinking of fueling like whole networks to produce green hydrogen, then we're thinking big scale stuff, I guess. And like he said, it's capital intensive. You need a lot of money to build up your renewable infrastructure before you can even start making the hydrogen to begin with. You also need water, so you have to be near a source of fresh water. So there's lots of other issues, or I guess I should say, challenges that could be part of that as well. So in the second part of his quote, he's saying, well, let's not just think about this transport network system. We should also think about like how this could transform individual houses and people could make their own hydrogen, which I think in and of itself seems like a really nice idea. But it's also, I think that's kind of an idea that's for a particular type of household, where we already have issues with the energy system in New Zealand where houses can't be heated to healthy temperatures. Some people can't afford electricity to even heat their homes. So there's a lot of other issues that I think, aren't going to be solved with this kind of approach. And so I also have this quote from Dorian, and he is an independent energy advisor, and he's offering more of a criticism of green hydrogen. And so he said, I personally believe hydrogen has gotten momentum from a number of factors. One, it aligns really well to infrastructure where there's big money today. It aligns to all our skill sets. It's got a transition pathway, even internet. There are also a set of organizations that whether they believe hydrogen has a high chance of success or not, it's still economically viable for them to pour a lot of money into it. I guess the other attraction for it is it appears to me that we don't need to change anything. So from a social perspective and energy culture's perspective, that it seems so easy, seems to slot in. Got all these problems in the biosystem and the environment, so we've got to get to the root cause of our problem, and chucking tons of money at getting clean is an option that's still not in balance by our environment. It's just stupidity. We're just wasting money because sooner or later we've got to change the system. So there's this sort of environmental groundswell that's nothing to do with energy, but to do with biodiversity and clean rivers and clean waters and changing the system. We just got to get everything in balance. We've got to reduce. And all this is just avoiding that conversation about how do we reduce what we use. It can be a transition to other things in terms of what drives the economy and drives jobs. But fundamentally, it's always got to be about reducing our material consumption, primarily in the way that has carbon impact, but in all sorts of other things as well. And I think Dorian's really getting at something that he's saying that, and he mentioned later in the interview, that he thought like green hydrogen has its place. It's going to decarbonize some of the stuff. That's fine. But it's just the way the narrative that it constructs isn't really thinking about these other systems. He said, we have to be thinking about biodiversity. We have to be thinking about the energy system and how it functions, how it could be greatly improved by reducing energy material consumption. And the hydrogen narrative avoids some of these tough questions that we're going to have to ask at some point. So whether green hydrogen prompts us to ask them and really question them, might not happen, but we still have to approach them at a certain point in time. And so I guess part of my conclusion is replacement isn't just enough. We can't just replace fossil fuels with something else, reduce carbon, and that is good or that is beneficial to society. Decarbonization energy transitions are more complicated than slotting. Our current energy system is ineffective. We think about the fossil narrative that's continuing to happen, but we also have systems of national and global inequality that are happening. Think about the networks that fossil fuels creates, this inequality between countries, sourcing things. We also have to think about how that's going to be affected in a transition where we require a lot of rare metals to make things like, solar, wind, and hydrogen electrolyzers. So are we just slotting in this new kind of like mining colonialism, for lack of a better term, on top of the fossil fuel system? So replacing an energy vector doesn't actually change the social system and how it functions. We have to be asking some deeper and better questions. And so the need for an energy transition is rooted in the climate crisis, a problem that's caused by the fossil system. Climate justice is intimately tied to other justices, racial, gender, decolonials. We have to be thinking about social systems in a way that is kind of uncomfortable, but is also really important because the energy system in history and today is perpetuating inequality. So tech solutions that are focused on just their technological improvements, just on their efficiency, really don't have the capacity to be liberating. They don't have the ability to transform our society in a way that we need to be able to adapt to the climate crisis. So I don't think that it's hopeless for green hydrogen. I think because green hydrogen is a developing technology, it has an opportunity to reevaluate its roles in the energy transition. This isn't the first time hydrogen has been proposed. It came in the 70s during the oil crisis. It appeared again, mostly during the Bush administration with the hydrogen economy. But there were some interesting things that I read, particularly in the 70s. A paper is focused on Sweden, but that hydrogen offered this opportunity for individual communities to be energy self-sufficient, I guess. So thinking about the network being spread out between communities instead of centralized. So there's different ways to use the technology that might actually be better, might be more effective, but in its current iteration, presenting green hydrogen as just a really nice fix for the fossil fuel industry doesn't sit well. Doesn't sit well with a lot of people. And so I think it's important for green hydrogen projects to maybe think about how that can be rubbing people the wrong way, how they could be more imaginative with the technology that they have. I think that it's productive and good, but it's just the narrative that we're using to promote it might need to change. And how we choose to understand energy technologies is really important. It can be used to challenge current and future energy systems if we want them to.
Okay. Thanks so much, Abby. That was so interesting. Now, I'm just conscious we have people online, so there might be some questions popping up there. But in the meantime, do we have any questions from the audience in person here today?
Yeah.
Yep.
What is like the hype around hydrogen, and is there a risk for fraud? Like over in the US, there was a trucking company called Renewably that produced that claimed to produce trucks, and that weren't really, it didn't have a fuel cell.
Yeah.
Is there a potential that this could like happen more? Potential fraud?
Just repeat the question for the Zoom people so they can hear them.
Yes, I'll try to paraphrase what you're saying, that the hype might produce situations where people might be lying about their technology. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that the way, particularly when it comes to any hydrogen media, when it comes from, say, particular truck companies or car manufacturing, they are avoiding certain things on purpose. And I think that's kind of the part of trying to sell something. So I've seen hydrogen cars here where they do really hype up the hydrogen part, but they don't tell you it also uses petrol because it has to, because there's not a hydrogen network where it can solely rely on hydrogen. So it's not, they're just occluding the truth intentionally, because without a network to supply a hydrogen car, you can't have a fully hydrogen car. And I know this was a particular issue during the hydrogen economy, early 2000s phase, where the idea was that you would still use fossil fuels in your car, but it would take away the carbon output, when it was like, that seemed, that was also a lie of sorts too. And so I think it's also dealing with the fact that like we've had these multiple phases of hydrogen coming through, and each time it's like it's something new. And I think that avoiding the conversation that like it's come out before, but why hasn't it worked before, would also be an important part of the conversation too. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
Is that a question online or just a comment?
Yes.
Okay, there is a question.
Okay.
It's a long one.
Okay, yes. Oh, hi, Nino. He listened to a podcast, Will Hydrogen Solve Our Energy Needs? There's skepticism about green hydrogen. From what I can recall, a tiny proportion of hydrogen used today is actually green. Most of it's produced from natural gas, greenhouse gas. One expert said green hydrogen is a creation from the hydrocarbon industry to sell more natural gas and to ensure more continued use of oil pipelines to transport hydrogen. What do you think? Do you agree? So I have heard this as well, that fossil fuel industries are just going to jump onto hydrogen as the next thing. I don't know if that's necessarily what is happening. I think that it's complex. From talking to lots of people that are working in this space, people's intentions are very good about creating technology that is not going to rely on fossil fuels. But then you're also dealing with these incredibly powerful industries who are likely to jump onto a technology that's going to continue to sustain the power and capital that they have. So it's likely they will move to something, if that's hydrogen, maybe. I think that the arguments of using current oil pipelines is more of an argument to use existing infrastructure, and whether that's possible or not is debatable, I suppose. But I think it is good in the sense that using what you have could be really effective, even if it's for a temporary span of time. So I'm not sure, Mina, I'm not sure. See if there's another question there.
I've got a question about the government's decision-making about the introduction of these new technologies. You know, right now it's quite a critical stage where you're considering the future of TY, the potential for Lake Onslow pumped hydro scheme worth billions of dollars. What about the decisions they're making around how do we think about investing in green hydrogen alongside these other energy systems that we might be looking into developing?
I think that's really tricky, and also because I didn't come from an energy background, so I feel like I've been trying to absorb a lot of information very quickly. And so I'm trying to understand what all these different projects mean, even understanding how the energy system works and that kind of thing. But I think that, and I didn't mention this, but I guess I should have, that because hydrogen requires so much investment and will require a lot of time to like build infrastructure, it's likely something that's not going to be really helpful for another 30 years, maybe. Like it's like we're really thinking far into the future. So it's like it has its place, but it's not an immediate solution. And so, yeah, like you mentioned, the hydro dam, there's talks about potentially could hydrogen be used as like similarly energy storage? I don't know. And with when the government released their what did they call it, like energy adaptation plan or whatever it was called, green hydrogen's not discussed. It's mentioned twice, I think. And they just say that it potentially could be a solution for long haul transport. And that seems to be where the focus is right now. There's a few trials testing out converting some trucks to be using some hydrogen and some diesel. And so in that sense, that's like moving forward in a particular industry that it's possible to move forward in. As far as big scale stuff, I don't think that would happen for a while. And so MB is supposed to release a green hydrogen roadmap. And they keep delaying it. They said it was going to be the end of this year. Now it's the end of next year. And that ideally is supposed to outline a more concrete plan. But I think a lot of people are finding, what I found in my interviews is no one's agreeing on where it should go or how it should be used. And I don't think the government wants to commit to anything because it seems very expensive.
Yeah, right. Yes, Richard.
Really interesting. In some of the comment about magic bullet, that I think there is a realization that there's no magic bullet, that we don't have a current system that transitions to a new system, that life goes on as normal, but we just don't have carbon capture or some alternative. Just wondering, I guess in a culture sense, whether you see that as risk or opportunity. On the opportunity side, one might argue that that's the opportunity, but there's an ongoing, I think, this debate about efficient and effective use and why, and then the why use it, rather than a single dominant energy source for much of what we do in our daily life, just continuing to push a single unified message of more is good.
Yeah. So you're saying that like green hydrogen presents an opportunity to at least debate these things?
Well, that's right. It's always in the system of aviation. Should we travel less? Currently, yes, there's no alternative, or when we need to travel, when we need to fly, what are the options or alternatives that are carbon zero or carbon? And perhaps it's going to be a more expensive option that is regulated. Fossil fuel aviation is regulated out of the system. So you're always asking the question of why am I using that energy rather than being sold on a compelling must.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's instead of thinking about, you're thinking more about energy rather than you're thinking about technology. Yeah, thinking about like how you use it rather than like what can I use to make sure I can still do what I'm doing. And I think that there's also like, I've been to a few hydrogen conferences, and it's just interesting that there's so much focus on just one technology when I feel like these conversations should be happening across disciplines. We should be like a conference on climate adaptation, on energy transitions, and like hydrogen is a piece of that. And just to I think that there's lots of actual science that goes on that's way above my head, that it comes to actually like using hydrogen and transporting it, that I think is all really important. But I also think that there's this weird kind of like science bubble that happens that is missing the bigger picture. And I think
what we do in this.
yeah, well, these conferences are at universities, and so it's like it's just like it feels odd for me, I suppose, to be like to focus on one molecule when it should be like a lot of other stuff.
Yeah. I'm sure you're inspiring your engineering colleagues on the project and opening their
Or
eyes to some of these
disturbing them.
issues. Yeah, maybe. One last quick question.
Another question about carbon hydrogen and projects like this will be used in carbon credits. So companies that can invest into hydrogen to as like to reduce carbon as they produce technology that reduces carbon emissions.
Yeah, so there was a couple conversations in my interviews about carbon credits, about there's no like policy right now for green hydrogen. And I think that innovators really want there to be some way that the government can assist them, whether it's like a credit or, something that helps to promote their product or promote the use of hydrogen. So that would be more like a thing about when the government comes out with this roadmap, maybe that will be part of it. I'm unsure. Some people also said carbon credits don't mean anything. So I don't know.
Okay, one last one, Kath.
I mean, I just want to say how interesting that was really, and how refreshing it is that you as a social scientist incorporated into this 5-year project. I imagine that it's been a lonely road because nobody eventually did. And
the only one.
is a problem because these are so much of this is not just about the energy technologies you've so clearly said. This is about people and decision making and prioritizing and changing narratives and getting a clear understanding of that. And I sort of wonder, part of the problem actually is conferences, and university of part of this, but the university is part of the problem because conferences tend to focus on particular specialties and to actually attract people into a gathering that actually brings people together requires a whole lot of other things that we could have a whole talk on.
Yeah.
What I guess is my question is where to from here in terms of your important point, in terms of having some influence over the narrative in terms of, do you go to the Energy Authority? Where in government do you go to, in the sense of pan government, so not just one party? Do you have any ideas? I guess that's what I'm interested in.
So I wish I did.
You might have to repeat.
Yes, okay. Just the question Kath asked was like, what's the next step in terms of like getting the social component of energy transitions and how we think about technology? What do we do with this information in my presentation? How do we make this more integrated into like tech spaces or energy spaces? And I'm not entirely sure. And like you said, this experience has been kind of isolating, and in that sense has been a bit depressing.
As a social scientist.
Yes, being the only social scientist looking at green hydrogen in New Zealand and really trying to make my information so that engineers can understand it. I really want to talk to people in a way that makes sense. But I think, if I'm being honest, I think that a lot of what I'm saying is dismissed because I think what green hydrogen researchers want is acceptability studies. I think they want me to look at people and say, will they like green hydrogen? Please tell us yes. And when I started the project, I said, it's not what I'm doing, partially because asking people if they like green hydrogen or not kind of doesn't mean anything, particularly at this stage, because people don't know what it is. But I want to offer some criticism to be like, the work you're doing is good. How could we make it better? And I think that they're stuck in that way of being like, technology is efficient and people just have to accept the technology because it's efficient. And they just have to get over it if they think that hydrogen's dangerous, if they think that hydrogen isn't what they want, they just have to get over that because it's coming. And more or less had people actually say that in interviews. And I think that like the quote that I used today isn't a criticism that's baseless. People have real critiques that are based in something that's meaningful, and it's really hard to present these ideas to people who are in the space that are capable of changing things, and they're like, this is tin hat conspiracy stuff, like I don't know. And I find it tricky to be in these technology kind of focused spaces because so much emphasis goes on the technology, and the social piece, partially because I'm the only one there, just kind of falls to the wayside. So I guess part of it would be like more projects that are interdisciplinary, but are truly interdisciplinary, like not have just the social bit tacked on, but like from the beginning, it's planned to be like, this is what the social scientists, hopefully there's more than one, are going to be doing. They have like a meaty part of the project. Like lots of Janet's stuff with energy cultures, like really starting your project and being like interdisciplinary from the start.
So true.
Maybe
Thank you.
could I just say just something that's come to my mind in terms of being proactive? And you may have done this already, but seems to me that possibly the conversation signing up to it as a parliamentary commissioner
Yes, yeah.
as to how the important work that you've been done, how that could get into a broader narrative and potentially through the parliamentary commission then generate the debate that you quite clearly are indicating needs to occur.
Right.
So before green hydrogen or whatever else comes along, to get everybody on a road where we know there's a cliff coming, and let's not go over that cliff, and let's get off. So it's just a suggestion.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, because his like statement, was it last year, did outline a lot of the common critiques of green hydrogen.
Yeah, this is Simon Upton, the
Yes.
parliamentary commissioner. for the
Yes.
environment,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I would just suggest getting a one-on-one with them to talk through what.
Yes, we did try to contact him for an interview, but as you can imagine, it was hard to get in contact. But I should try again. No, that's a good point.
Well, Abbi, thank you so much. That was really insightful. And, I think you speak to a lot of issues that we're all dealing with in our interdisciplinary work that we're trying to do. And thank goodness for critical voices like yours within these debates. And thanks so much. And please join me in thanking Abbi for her